Have a listen to this, listeners. Imagine you're in Chelyabinsk in Russia on a cold, clear, I think it's a morning. You might hear a dog. Roof, roof. A bird. Woof. Then all hell breaks loose. Listen to that sound. Be excused for thinking it was a nuclear war beginning. It was a fireball, something from outer space that vaporized in the atmosphere. Created a hell of a lot of damage. This happened not that long ago, so we've got the audio recording. But I think something even larger happened in 1908 in Tunguska. And, believe it or not, it was on this very day. It's been a bit of a mystery. You may have seen those pictures on in books and on the internet. What's a book? What's a book? All the trees fallen over in one direction. Someone who looks into this sort of thing from Western Australia, happy lockdown, is Dr. Aaron Kavosi. Oh, God, I hope I got your surname right. Is it Kavosi or Kovasi?
Spot on, Graham. It's Kavosi. Well done.
Oh, it was luck, not loveliness, Dr. Aaron Kavosi. Yeah, so the Tunguska fireball, I suspect some people will be familiar with this. What the hell was it and how do we know?
Well, it's one of the great mysteries of recent time. And by recent, over the last century or so.
And what exactly happened?
Years ago.
Yeah.
Well, it's easy to look back, not as you were witnessing it, but from a distance. It's a detective story, and so it's a matter of putting clues together. The best that science has been able to tell is that a large asteroid came in, what's called nowadays an NEO, a near-Earth object, and it exploded over the sky of Siberia, probably at an elevation of on the order of about 5 kilometers above the surface. It would have been screaming towards Earth, probably at 15 to 20 kilometers per second. And when it blew, it took out a large area of Siberia with it. That's the speculation.
Okay. How did anyone find this out? Because I understand there's no crater and there's no meteorite to go and pick up.
Okay, now we get to the nitty-gritty of the mystery. So what do we know? What are facts as separate from fiction? The thing is, the event occurred in 1908, but proper scientists getting in to do their forensic study of the site, that didn't happen for on the order of 20 years. It was only in the 1920s that investigative parties were able to go in and poke around with the right kind of mindsets. Russia was under all sorts of political upheaval, plus the place was bloody remote. And at that point in time, it was just difficult to access. What they found when they got out there, though, was nothing short of fascinating. And as you mentioned, it has fueled these iconic images of a decimated landscape where all the trees are knocked down like matchsticks. That didn't happen right afterwards. Those images were taken decades later. And so even decades later, the landscape was still very much devastated and desolate, and a very stunning thing to encounter out in the middle of nowhere. And so you touched on a few of the lingering mysteries. There's no crater that was formed, and so it wasn't like a classical asteroid strike that excavates a crater. Those are very energetic events. And people have not found evidence of the space rock. No fragments or meteorites, fragments of the asteroid, were found or have been recovered. And so the crime occurred, so to speak, but all the evidence of the murder weapon has disappeared. And that's why it's a difficult thing to piece together.
So how can it be ascertained that it was an asteroid? Could it have been a comet?
Well, there are a lot of different approaches in modern investigation of these kinds of phenomena by planetary scientists and others that study high energy events like this. And there's several different lines of evidence that have come into play. The first really relevant data were that actually came out of kind of an unexpected field, and that is the nuclear testing, because basically atmospheric nuclear tests were releasing a very large amount of energy at some elevation. And so all this energy erupted from one location and was deposited into the atmosphere, and obviously had massive effects on the ground. And so by understanding the systematics of how nuclear bombs release energy from above, people were able to start putting together that this was a very high energy event. Many of us are probably aware of the tragic Hiroshima bombing of Japan. That was a 15,000-ton event in terms of equivalent of tons of TNT. And to put that in perspective, the Tunguska event is thought of on the scale of megatons, millions of tons of TNT. So it's much, much higher energy release than what we kind of know and associate with pretty dramatic and devastating events from nuclear weapons. And so it's just on a different scale. It's on a different magnitude. It's things that people haven't seen before.
In 2013, Chelyabinsk, we heard the explosion. It's dramatic, and the pictures are dramatic as well. How does that compare with what happened at Tunguska?
It is very dramatic. Chelyabinsk, the world had a front row seat of what happens and what kinds of hazards from space are out there. Chelyabinsk itself was another NEO, near-Earth object, and this one screamed across the sky. To put it in perspective and comparing it with Tunguska, why Russia is such a target, that's the real mystery here.
I'm wondering, probably.
Nonetheless,
yeah.
Tunguska was it's thought to have released about 5 megatons of energy, TNT equivalent, into the atmosphere when it blew. Chelyabinsk released what's thought to be about half of a megaton of energy. So it's a tenth of the energy release. So it's a much smaller event, which really I think is harrowing, because the Chelyabinsk event affected lots of people, created a massive amount of damage, and injured humans. So it was a much smaller event, and it was a very dramatic effect on the people living in the area.
And as far as frequency goes, this is less than a little over 100 years ago, and then another one in 2013. That's, as far as astronomical time goes, all the time. These things are happening basically all the time, aren't they?
Yeah, you're right. But listen, people don't need to be afraid. There's actually observatories in government agencies that spend their time and spend resources, meaning money, tracking and monitoring NEOs, these near-Earth objects, precisely for this reason.
But they missed Chelyabinsk, didn't they? They didn't give a warning for Chelyabinsk.
Well, that's right. That one also came during the daytime, which makes it trickier to see.
Oh.
The frequency, it's a great question, and it really depends on how big it is. And the way this works is pretty simple. Smaller things pass by us more often than bigger things. Yeah. And so the relative interval of when we can expect Tunguska scale events, fortunately, it all depends on how big we think the rock was, but it's on the order of several hundreds of years. So the chances, statistically, of having a Tunguska event anytime soon is extremely low. Certainly not impossible, but it's low.
Okay.
Chelyabinsk, on the other hand, is an event thought to have that rock was thought to have been on the order of around 20 meters. and rather than a rock from Tunguska that would have been on the order of 50 meters in terms of the object. And the Chelyabinsk size passage occurs more frequently, so on the order of every 50 years, plus or minus a few decades. And so should we expect to see another Chelyabinsk next week? Not likely. Not impossible, but not likely.
For such for such a big explosion, 5 megatons, despite, no crater, who cares? It's a huge explosion. Okay, fair enough. It's really, really remote as well. But there must have been either some eyewitness or first-hand recording of it, rather than just the photographs taken decades later?
Well, some of these early Russian investigations that went in, again, long after the event, interviewed people living in these remote areas, some very near and some further away. And there are some anecdotal stories of people describing being woken out of their structures and having windows and structures collapse on them, and lights in the night sky all of a sudden being very bright. So there's people that described what they saw, but of course most people were woken up out of a sleep to all of this chaos, and of course no one had a baseline understanding of how to even describe what was going on.
Yeah.
They described all kinds of terrifying things.
Yeah.
Listen, there were a lot less people on Earth in 1908.
Yeah.
There's many more people now, and so it would be harder to find an event like this taking place without a lot of people to watch.
Yeah, in Tunguska, it's pretty hard to get to and pretty hard to live, and not many people there. Just one, we're going to have to go in a second, but just one anecdotal thing from an eyewitness. Apparently, this bloke nearby said, at that moment I became so hot that I couldn't bear it, as if my shirt was on fire. From the northern side, where the fire was, came strong heat. I wanted to tear off my shirt and throw it down, but then the sky shut closed and a strong thump sounded. I was thrown a few meters. It rings true, doesn't it?
Listen, it sounds like science fiction, but experiencing one of these events would be absolutely life-changing and terrifying. And if you were too close to it, it would be the end game for you, mate. Yeah.
Dr. Aaron Kavosi, thank you so much. On this very day, 1908, that's part one of Today in History. Dr. Aaron Kavosi, Curtin University, Western Australia, good luck with your lockdown, and we'll leave you with the sound of the most recent blast of this sort from Chelyabinsk. It's an astounding sound.
Cheers, Graham. Thanks for having me on.